The memory of that Christmas Eve is etched into me, a frozen scar on my mind that still aches when the winter winds howl. I was 15, a stubborn age where you cling to the last shreds of childhood magic, while desperately pretending you're above it all. And I was determined to be the last one awake in the old farmhouse, to savor the silent, sparkling anticipation that only exists in the deep hours of December 24th. My parents had long since retired. Their murmured goodnights and the eventual, familiar rasp of my father's snore drifting down the staircase, a sound as much a part of the house as the creak of its timber bones. The world outside was a study in absolute white, a 3-foot-deep blanket of fresh snow that had fallen steadily since dusk, muting every sound and sealing us off from the rest of the sleeping county. Inside, the only light came from our Christmas tree, a real spruce we'd chopped down ourselves, its strings of multicolored bulbs casting a kaleidoscope of shifting, sentimental shadows across the living room walls. The fireplace, which had roared cheerfully all evening, was now a pit of pulsating embers, each breath of the dying fire making the shadows on the ceiling lurch and crawl. The air was thick with the comforting, fragrant smells of the season: pine sap, the ghost of gingerbread cookies, the waxy perfume of half-burnt candles. I was burrowed into the couch, a quilt around my legs, watching some forgotten movie on low volume, bathing in that perfect, cozy solitude. It was a scene from a greeting card, utterly peaceful, until the first sound from the basement violated it. It wasn't a loud sound, but in that profound quiet, it was a seismic event, a deep, resonant thump, the kind a heavy dictionary makes when dropped flat on a dirt floor. My thumb paused on the remote. My breath hitched. I told myself it was the furnace, an ancient, hulking beast in the basement that groaned and complained like a living thing. But the furnace had its own language of metallic clanks and whooshes. This was different. Solid. Deliberate. A moment later, it came again. Thump. Then, a slow, grating drewag, like a piece of furniture, being reluctantly shifted across an uneven surface. A coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature seeped into my gut. The basement was my father's domain, a place of dusty canning jars, forgotten tools, and a pervasive, damp chill that seeped up through the packed earth floor. The door to it, a heavy, painted thing with a 1940s-era glass knob and a rusted deadbolt the size of my hand, was always kept locked. My father was adamant about it. "Stairs are rotten in spots," he'd say, "and I don't want you or your mother taking a tumble." It was a rule as ingrained as saying grace. The dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, expectant. I sat frozen, my eyes glued to the doorway that led to the kitchen, where that ominous basement door stood sentinel. The colored lights from the tree painted the hallway in alternating hues of red, green, and blue, and I could just see the faint outline of the doorknob, a dull gleam in the intermittent light. Then, a new sound began, a soft, persistent scratching. It was faint at first, like a mouse in the wall, but it grew steadily closer, moving from the far corner of the basement to the foot of the wooden staircase. My heart began a frantic drum solo against my ribs. This wasn't random. This was a trajectory. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. It was climbing the stairs. Each scratch was followed by the faintest dry rasp, a sound I could only equate to something being pulled up each step. 13 steps. I counted them in my head, a childhood habit from fetching preserved goods for my mother. The scratching ascended to the 7th step, the 8th. It was now halfway up. A terrifying logic overrode my paralysis. If it was on the stairs, it was between the basement floor and the kitchen. There was no other exit. The thing, whatever it was committing to coming up. The scratching reached the landing at the top of the stairs, right behind the door. It stopped. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic pulse in my own ears. I watched helpless as the glass doorknob began to turn. It rotated slowly, almost lazily, to the left until it met the resistance of the locked deadbolt. It stopped, then rotated back. Then it jiggled. Not a violent shaking, but a precise, testing motion, a gentle, inquisitive rattle of metal against metal. Someone or something was on the other side, exploring the lock with a patient, intelligent curiosity. A small, pathetic sound escaped my throat, a whimper I swallowed too late. The jiggling ceased. For a full minute, nothing. I dared to hope it had given up, that it was just some bizarre atmospheric pressure thing, a waking dream. Then, the sound of breathing began. It seeped under the door, a wet, ragged, struggling inhalation and exhalation that sounded wrong, like it was being filtered through fluid or torn cloth. It was the sound of a sick animal or a man with a punctured lung. With the sound came a smell cutting through the pine and gingerbread, a dank, organic odor of wet soil, rotten potatoes, and something coppery, like old blood. And then, the darkness under the door changed. It wasn't shadow from the shifting tree lights. It was a substantive blackness, a pooling, ink-like presence that spilled onto the worn linoleum of the kitchen floor. It didn't reflect light. It absorbed it, a spreading stain of pure void. And from that darkness, the voices rose. They were a layered whisper, a chorus of disparate tones, a man's gravelly rumble, a woman's reedy plea, the high, clear note of a child, all speaking in perfect, strained unison, their words bubbling up as if from a deep, cold well. He said we could come up for Christmas. They sighed. The words saturated with a heartbreaking, hollow longing that made my eyes prickle with involuntary tears. It was the longing that broke the fear's hold on me. That terrible, human want in that utterly inhuman voice launched me from the couch. I stumbled backward, my socks slipping on the hardwood, my eyes still locked on the spreading black pool. I fled up the stairs to my parents' room, crashing through the door, babbling incoherently, pointing back toward the kitchen. My father, a man of solid Midwestern practicality, groaned himself awake, his face a mask of annoyed concern. My mother switched on her bedside lamp, her eyes wide. Something's in the basement. I finally managed to choke out. It spoke. It's at the door. My father, sighing heavily, grabbed the Louisville Slugger he kept propped in the corner and motioned for me to stay put. My mother, wrapping her robe around herself, took a heavy flashlight from the dresser. I refused to be left alone, clinging to her like a toddler as we descended. The living room was empty. The Christmas tree twinkled innocently. The kitchen was silent. The pool of darkness was gone. The basement door was shut, the deadbolt firmly, visibly locked. My father shot me a look that was equal parts relief and irritation. "Bad dream, kiddo," he said, his voice softening. "Wind, old house. Plays tricks." To prove his point, he jangled his keys, found the old skeleton key for the deadbolt, and unlocked it. The bolt slid back with a solid, rusty clunk. He pushed the door open, revealing the yawning black maw of the staircase. My mother shone the powerful beam down. It illuminated the dusty washer and dryer, the shelves of jars, the old steamer trunk. Nothing moved. The air from below was cold and still, smelling only of damp earth and laundry detergent. "See," my father said, his shoulders slumping. "All quiet. Now let's—" His sentence died as my mother's flashlight beam, sweeping across the door itself, froze. On the back of the door, the side that faced the basement, were handprints. Dozens of them. Small, muddy handprints, the fingers slender, the palms tiny. They were all clustered at the lower half of the door, at the height of a young child. And every single one was oriented upwards, fingers pointing toward the top of the stairs, as if a group of children had been pressing against the door, pushing with all their might, trying to get out. The mud was fresh, dark, and smelled of that same wet, earthy decay. No one spoke. My father quietly closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and tested it twice. We moved out the following July. The official story was a job transfer. We never spoke of that night again, not once, not even in glances. But sometimes in the deep silence of a Christmas Eve, when the house is asleep and the tree lights are the only glow, I think I can hear that wet, struggling breath. And I hear that chorus of lost voices, their terrible, plaintive wish. And I am haunted not just by what was in the basement, but by the question that has gnawed at me for decades. Who was the he that promised them they could come up? Was it a former owner? A cruel child from long ago? Or was it my own father, when he took that old, rusted deadbolt off its mount to replace it with a shiny new one the very next morning, inadvertently breaking the seal that had held them down there for who knows how long, setting them free into our world, or worse, into whatever cold, dark spaces lie between the walls of every old, silent house waiting for Christmas night? The silence of the Megamart on Christmas night wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, an oppressive hollow left behind after the month-long scream of frantic commerce. The last customer had staggered out at 9:58 p.m., clutching a pathetic last-ditch poinsettia, and by 10:15, the final manager had slapped my shoulder, muttered "Merry Christmas, hold down the fort," and vanished into the glittering parking lot. I was alone, just me, and a million square feet of discounted cheer. My sole duty to walk the neon-lit canyons every hour and ensure no desperate soul had decided to spend the holiday hiding in a bathroom stall. The familiar Christmas music had been switched off, leaving only the industrial hum of the refrigeration units, a deep, tonal vibration you felt in your teeth more than heard. My footsteps, heavy in worn-out security boots, echoed with a ridiculous, theatrical clarity against the polished concrete. Aisles that just hours before had been battlegrounds over the last talking doll or discounted gaming console now lay in a state of post-apocalyptic stillness, littered with stray bits of torn packaging and overturned sale signs. The air still smelled faintly of popcorn from the shuttered concession stand and the cloying, artificial cinnamon from the seasonal spray they'd doused the place with. I started my first round at 10:30, my flashlight beam a redundant pioneer in the relentless, fluorescent glare. It was in the home goods section, aisle 7 to be precise, that the environment first betrayed me. I was passing the coffee makers, my mind a numb blank, when a wave of cold, so intense it felt like a physical slap, hit me square in the chest. My breath erupted in a thick, rolling plume of vapor, hanging in the air. Above me, with a sound like a dozen insects being zapped, the motion sensor lights flickered violently and died, plunging the entire aisle into darkness. The aisles to the left and right remained brightly lit, framing this new pool of shadow like a proscenium arch. And there, at the far end where the aisle met the back wall, a figure stood. My brain, desperate for normalcy, initially processed it as a leftover cardboard display. But displays don't have posture. This thing was tall, impossibly gaunt, and dressed in a suit that was a grotesque parody of Santa's fur-trimmed red velvet. The material was a filthy, faded maroon, shredded at the cuffs and hem, and the white trim was a matted yellow-gray, like the fur of a long-dead animal. It stood perfectly rigid, facing the shelves. Then, my radio on my belt crackled to life, making me jump nearly out of my skin. It was Gary, the overnight monitor in the control room, his voice tinny and confused. "Hey, you seeing this on aisle 7 camera? There's a glitch. The feed keeps pixelating and freezing. You near there?" I fumbled for the button, my eyes locked on the motionless figure. My voice came out a dry whisper. "It's not a glitch. I'm looking at him." A pause filled with static. "Looking at who?" My screen shows a thermal blob and a lot of visual noise, but you're the only human signature in the sector. You're standing alone. As if triggered by our communication, the figure's head began to move. It didn't turn. It rotated in a series of stiff, mechanical jerks, one click at a time, until its profile was visible. There was no beard. The face was a pale, elongated blur, like a face seen through a fog window, devoid of any readable features except for two deep, dark pits where eyes should have been. I raised my flashlight, my hand trembling, so badly the beam danced a jig across the ceiling. "Sir, the store is closed. You need to leave." The thing, this not Santa, ignored me. It raised one long, spindly arm. The hand was wrong. The fingers too many joints, ending in dark, pointed tips. It didn't point at me. It extended that dreadful finger past me, down the length of the dark aisle, pointing with silent, unwavering intention towards the front of the store, towards the seasonal department. And then, between one blink and the next, it vanished. Not like it walked away. The space it occupied was simply empty. The lights above me buzzed and flared back to life, blindingly bright. The cold dissipated, leaving the air warm and stale again. My heart was a frantic animal trying to batter its way out of my ribs. Gary's voice squawked again. "What's going on?" My feed just cleared. You okay? It pointed. I mumbled into the radio, already moving, driven by a compulsion I didn't understand. It pointed to seasonal. I broke into a jog, my boots slapping against the floor, past the silent televisions showing their own black mirrors, past the racks of lonely holiday sweaters. I burst into the massive seasonal section. The towering, inflatable snowmen were deflated, slumped heaps of vinyl. The animatronic reindeer were still, their heads bowed. In the center, where a jovial Santa throne had presided for weeks, surrounded by fake presents and a plyboard fireplace, there was now only empty space. And in the exact center of that space, sitting directly on the scuffed tile floor, was a single, poorly wrapped gift. It was a small box, about the size of a shoebox, swaddled in brittle, yellowed newspaper instead of festive paper. It was tied with a coarse length of butcher's twine, knotted in a messy, clumsy bow. Every instinct screamed at me not to touch it, to call Gary, to wait for the police. But a deeper, more terrified curiosity pulled me forward. This was a message. It had been left for me. I knelt, the cold from the floor seeping through my pants. The newspaper was ancient, the headlines speaking of local events from decades past. I untied the rough twine, the fibers scratching my fingers. I peeled back the paper. Inside a plain, unmarked cardboard box lay a doll. A vintage porcelain doll with matted blonde hair, one intact blue eye that stared glassily upward, and one empty socket revealing a hollow darkness within. Its frilly lace dress was stained with ugly brown spots. Its tiny porcelain hand was clenched in a fist. Gently, dread turning my stomach to ice water, I pried the cold fingers open. Inside was a faded Polaroid photograph. The image showed the interior of a store, but not this modern megamart. It was a smaller, older department store, with wood-paneled walls and different signage. In the foreground, a genuinely cheerful Santa, with a real white beard, sat on a similar throne, holding a child on his lap. But my eyes were drawn to the background, to the gloom beside a rack of heavy wool coats. There, just barely visible, was a tall, thin shape, a smear of faded red and gray, its blurred face turned toward the camera, toward Santa. On the back of the Polaroid, in an elegant, feminine cursive that had bled into the paper with age, was written, "I take the ones he leaves behind. I've been waiting for you to be alone." The sentence didn't make sense, but its malice was crystalline. As I stared at it, trying to parse its meaning, the store's PA system, dead all night, crackled and emitted a deafening, sustained blare of pure alarm. The code read for a security breach at the main entrance. Gary's voice shrieked from my radio, stripped of all professionalism, raw with panic. Code read, "Front entrance breach alarm. It's inside. It's in the store with you, man." I see it on the camera. It's his transmission cut off into a burst of static, followed by a low, rhythmic thumping sound that could have been a struggle or a head being knocked against a console. And then, from maybe 2 aisles over in electronics, I heard it. A soft, shuffling footstep. Then another. And underneath it, a faint, discordant humming. It was trying to mimic the tune of Jingle Bells, but the notes were flat, the rhythm syncopated and wrong, like a music box winding down. I didn't run for the front doors. Whatever had tripped that seal was now between me and the exit. I ran for the heart of the store, to the employee break room, a windowless box with a solid keylock door. I slammed it shut, locked it, and barricaded it with a table, my hands shaking so violently I could barely dial 911. The police found me an hour later, catatonic on the floor. They found Gary too, still in his swivel chair in the control room. He was facing away from the monitors. When they turned him around, his face was a mask of frozen, abject terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. Cause of death was later listed as a massive heart attack. Clutched in his rigid hand, pried loose only with difficulty, was a single, cracked porcelain eye from a doll. The official report suggested a tragic coincidence, a stress-induced episode for me, and a pre-existing condition for Gary. The broken doll and Polaroid were logged as found items, likely left by a customer. I resigned the next morning, but the story doesn't end with my resignation. Every year, as Christmas approaches, a package arrives at whatever address I currently live at. No return address. Always postmarked from a different city. Inside is never a threat, not in words. It's always a small, grimy, tactile piece of that night. One year, a single tarnished jingle bell that smelled of old copper. Another, a scrap of coarse, blood-red velvet. Last year, a lock of synthetic white hair, coarse and greasy to the touch. They are reminders. Not that it was there, but that it is there. It's in the empty silence after closing time, in the dark aisle of every big box store, waiting in the wings. It doesn't care about the merry children on Santa's lap. It waits for the stragglers, the lonely, the ones left behind after the lights go down. And on that particular Christmas night, in that empty store, it had been waiting for Gary and me. It took Gary, and the packages tell me, in their silent, awful language, that my turn is still to come. The decision to drive home for Christmas through the heart of the blizzard was born from a stubborn, youthful defiance against both the weather reports and my mother's pleading voice on the phone. I was 22, invincible in that brittle way young adults are, convinced my old but faithful sedan and my determination were a match for anything the sky could throw down. For the first hour, it felt like an adventure. The wipers fighting a losing battle against the swirling white, the world beyond my headlights reduced to a chaotic, howling void. Then, the adventure curdled into tension, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my back aching from leaning forward, trying to decipher the ghostly outline of the lane dividers that were being swallowed by the minute. The radio had given up to static an hour ago, and my phone had long since become a useless brick, no service bars, the GPS a frozen, spinning circle of despair. The only signs of civilization were the occasional reflective markers on the side of the road, and I'd passed 130 miles back that read, "Next services 30 miles," with a grim finality. I was in the middle of nowhere, a specific, snow-choked nowhere that felt increasingly like another planet. The car, my trusty companion through college and back, began to protest. A shudder ran through its frame, a cough from the engine that wasn't a cough, but a death rattle. The heater, which had been blowing lukewarm, pathetic air, died completely. Then the headlights dimmed, flickered, and the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree of warning lights before plunging into darkness. The engine gave one final, weary sigh and went silent. The sudden quiet was a physical shock, broken only by the moan of the wind and the thwop-thwop-thwop of the wipers frozen mid-swipe. I coasted to a stop on the non-existent shoulder, the tires crunching into deep virgin snow. I was buried, sealed in a cold, metal tomb. Panic, hot and acidic, rose in my throat. I tried the ignition again and again, met only with a sickening click. I grabbed my phone, waving it around the cabin like a mystical talisman, praying for a single bar. Nothing. The windows were already frosting over, sealing me in. I had half a tank of gas, but running it for heat in a dead car was a one-way ticket to carbon monoxide poisoning. The cold began to infiltrate immediately, a sly, creeping invasion that seeped through the floorboards and the door seals, biting at my ankles and fingertips. I watched the digital clock on my dead radio, the minutes stretching into a vast, frozen eternity. An hour passed. My breath plumed in the air, and a terrifying lethargy began to wrap around my thoughts. This is how it happens, I remember thinking with a strange detachment. People just vanish into storms like this, found weeks later in a snowdrift. Just as I was weighing the suicidal impulse of trying to walk for help, a glow appeared in my rearview mirror. 2 pinpricks of amber light, weak and bleary through the blowing snow, but moving. A wave of relief, so profound it brought tears to my eyes, washed over me. Another car. A plow, maybe. Salvation. The vehicle pulled up slowly behind me, not a plow, but an old tow truck, a boxy, early 80s model painted a faded industrial blue, with a single slowly rotating yellow beacon on its roof. The driver's door opened, and a figure climbed out, bulky in a heavy, knee-length parka with the hood pulled up tight against the storm. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace through the thigh-deep snow, not struggling, just parting it. He came to my window. I frantically scraped at the frost on the inside and rolled it down, a blast of Arctic air, stealing what little warmth I had left. "Broken down?" he asked. His voice was raspy, thin, like paper being slowly torn, and it was swallowed almost completely by the wind. I stumbled over my words, explaining about the engine, the cold, my phone. He listened, his head tilted slightly, his face completely hidden in the deep shadow of his hood. He nodded once, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "I can give you a lift. Nearest town's Granite Falls, about 10 miles west on the county road. Garage is closed for the holiday, but Ed, he owns it, lives above it. He'll let you use his phone, get you warmed up. I'll come back for the car tomorrow, tow it in." It was more than I could have hoped for. Gratitude made me dizzy. I stammered my thanks, grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat, and hurried after him as he turned and trudged back to his truck. I climbed into the high passenger seat, slamming the door shut on the storm. The cab was blessedly warm, but the air inside had a strange, layered smell. The expected sense of stale coffee and diesel fuel, but underneath, a cloying, sweet odor, like cheap air freshener or dried flowers. And beneath even that, a dank, wet earth smell, like a root cellar. He put the truck in gear and pulled slowly back onto the invisible road. "Thank you," I said again, my teeth still chattering. "I didn't think anyone would be out here." He just grunted. For the first few minutes, I was just happy to be moving, to be saved. I stared out the side window, seeing nothing but my own pale reflection and the swirling white beyond. But slowly, a nagging unease began to prick at my relief. He wasn't following the main highway I'd been on. At a junction I hadn't even seen, he turned onto a narrower, unplowed track that plunged directly into a forest of dense, black pine trees. The plow had clearly not been down here in days, if ever. "Is this a shortcut?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Yeah," he said, the raspy voice flat. "Quicker this way." The trees closed in, their snow-laden branches scraping against the sides of the truck with a sound like long, skeletal fingernails. The sweet, rotten smell in the cab seemed to intensify, coating the back of my throat. My eyes, adjusting to the dim, green glow of the dashboard lights, drifted down to his hands on the wheel. And that's when the first real, cold finger of terror traced my spine. His hands were all wrong. They were clad in thin, gray cloth gloves, but even through the material, I could see the fingers were too long, the knuckles too large and pronounced. The skin at his wrists, where the glove met his coat sleeve, was a sickly, mottled blue-gray, like the flesh of a long-drowned thing. And they were clean. Impossibly, unnaturally clean for a tow truck driver who had just been out in a blizzard hooking up a car. No grease, no grime, no traces of snowmelt. My breath hitched. I forced myself to look slowly toward him, pretending to glance out his window. In the faint light, I saw a sliver of his profile within the hood. A sharp, bluish chin. A lipless seam of a mouth that was a straight, dark line. No stubble, no texture. Just a smooth, waxy plane. "Almost there," the gravelly voice said, but the dark line of the mouth did not move. Not even a flicker. A primal understanding, deeper than thought, screamed through every nerve in my body. This was wrong. This was not a man. This was something wearing the shape of one, a costume of flesh and parka, and it had been waiting on that desolate road. It wasn't offering salvation, it was collecting a resource. The truck slowed, and we bumped into a clearing. There was no town. There was a dilapidated two-story farmhouse, its windows black and gaping, its porch sagging. Next to it, a listing barn. In the yard, a gutted, rusted-out station wagon sat on cinder blocks, half buried in snow. This was not Granite Falls. This was a lair. As the truck rolled to a stop, I didn't think. Survival instinct overrode every other function. I threw my shoulder against the heavy door, bursting it open, and flung myself out into the knee-deep snow. I heard his door open behind me, a soft, precise click, but no shout, no command to stop. I just ran. I crashed into the wall of pines, the branches whipping my face, the snow swallowing my legs to the thighs with every plunging step. I ran blindly, fueled by pure animal terror, the cold air searing my lungs. I ran until a stitch in my side felt like a knife wound and my legs were leaden, burning weights. I collapsed behind a massive, fallen log, pressing myself into the snow and rotting leaves beneath it, trying to silence my ragged, sobbing breaths. I listened. The wind howled. Trees creaked. But no footsteps. No crunch of pursuit. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to lift my head and peer back toward the clearing. The truck was gone. No tire tracks led in or out. The blizzard had scoured them away. But then I saw them. Leading from the direction of the road, right through the untouched snow, were a set of tracks. They were long, narrow impressions, too deep for a man of his supposed weight. They weren't boot prints. They were pointed at the front, with a deep, singular puncture at the tip and a faint, dragging line behind the heel. They were the tracks of something that walked on pointed, delicate feet. And they stopped dead in the snow about 10 feet from my log. They didn't turn around. They didn't wander off. They just ended, as if the maker had simply vanished into the freezing air. I must have passed out from cold and exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, a blinding white light was in my face and a man's voice, a real human voice thick with concern, was saying, "Jesus Christ, son, what are you doing out here?" It was a sheriff's deputy in a massive snowcat, out looking for stranded motorists. He bundled me in blankets, gave me hot coffee from a thermos, and listened to my fractured, hysterical story as he drove me back to the county station. When I described the tow truck and the driver, his face went carefully blank. When I said the name Granite Falls, he and the dispatcher exchanged a long look. "Son," the deputy said gently, almost kindly, "Granite Falls ain't been a town since the late 70s. The mine closed, everyone left. It's a ghost town, just a few falling down buildings." My blood froze anew. "And the garage?" "Ed." The deputy's expression turned to one of pity. "Edgar Wilcox. He ran the only garage. A good mechanic, folks said, but lonely. They found him on December 26, 1978. He'd hanged himself from the rafters in his own service bay on Christmas Eve. No note. They never found my car. Not a trace. It was as if the snow had opened up and swallowed it whole. The deputy suggested I'd gotten disoriented, hypothermic, hallucinated the truck and the driver. He said my mind, in its desperation, had probably conjured a savior from old local tales. I let them believe it. It was easier. But I know what I saw. I know what those tracks were. And every year since, without fail, when the first big blizzard of the winter hits, I get a phone call. Always late at night. The caller ID shows unknown, or sometimes a string of numbers that doesn't exist. I answer, because not answering feels more dangerous. There's never a voice. Just the sound of staticky, distant Christmas music, tinny and warped, like a transmission from a dead radio station. And underneath the music, if I listen very closely, I can hear it. The soft, relentless crunch drag of something moving through deep, deep snow. It's a reminder. The road is always there. The storm is always waiting. And he's always out there, in his faded blue truck, looking for the next stranded soul to offer a lift to a town that doesn't exist.